It was a simple task, sorting through tax documents and organizing the year's financial records. But what he stumbled upon in the middle of the afternoon would shatter his world. A series of unexpected bank statements caught his eye, their numbers too strange to ignore, and they sent a cold chill down his spine. At first, he convinced himself it was just a mistake. Maybe they were an old set of records, something left over from a past year. But no, these were current, the dates were recent, and the transactions listed were not his doing. His hands trembled as he scanned the figures, and a heavy realization began to settle in. He wasn't just looking at numbers, he was looking at the unraveling of his life. Paul Hamilton was a man who had always prided himself on his ability to provide for his family. He had built a stable career in accounting, a solid home for his wife, Sarah, and their 2 children. For the most part, his marriage had been one of mutual respect, built on years of shared history. But the serenity he had so carefully cultivated was about to be obliterated. His thoughts swirled. How could he have missed something like this? They had talked about their finances. They had made plans. His mind flashed back to their last conversation about the kids' college fund, and something felt off. It was almost as if he'd been kept in the dark for years, lulled into complacency by a smile he thought he knew well. Paul took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't just a financial mistake. It was something far more dangerous, and now he had to figure out just what his wife had been hiding, and why. The morning had started like any other. Paul had sat down with a cup of coffee, opened his laptop, and began organizing the tax documents for the year. It was a routine he'd grown accustomed to, something that didn't require much thought. But as he sorted through the papers, something didn't seem quite right. One set of bank statements caught his eye, wedged between the usual records. They weren't familiar, at least not in the way the others were. They were from an account he had never seen before, and the transactions didn't match anything in the family's standard spending patterns. Paul's heart raced. The amounts were too large to be overlooked, yet he had never seen this account. He set the other papers aside and focused on the statements, trying to make sense of the entries. Bills, transfers, payments. Nothing unusual at first glance. But then he noticed a recurring pattern. There were unexplained withdrawals, large sums of money siphoned away in amounts that didn't correlate with any of the family's normal expenses. He checked the dates again. These transactions had occurred just a few months ago, right under his nose. His confusion quickly turned to suspicion. His wife had always managed the household finances, and up until now, he had trusted her implicitly. They'd always kept a tight grip on their finances, planning every purchase and saving for their children's future. Or so he thought. But now, with each strange entry, his gut twisted tighter. The fear creeping in was unlike anything he had experienced before. He couldn't stop now. There had to be an explanation. But what if there wasn't one? What if Sarah had been hiding something more than just a few bad financial decisions? What if this was something far darker? Paul took a deep breath, his pulse quickening, and continued to dig deeper into the records, hoping for a simple explanation, but knowing deep down that it was unlikely. Paul didn't stop searching. Each new transaction he uncovered only deepened his unease. As he scrolled through the entries, they started to form a clearer picture, one that made his stomach churn. There was a pattern here, one that suggested careful planning, not the mistakes of an unsuspecting spouse. The amounts, once small and seemingly inconsequential, were growing larger as he dug through the past years. Each withdrawal, each transfer, seemed to follow a calculated rhythm. His heart sank as he traced the money back through various accounts, some of which were registered in Sarah's name alone. Then, the devastating realization hit him. His wife had been siphoning money from their children's college fund, funneling it into various other accounts for years. Paul froze, the weight of it all crashing over him. The college fund, the very fund they had both worked so hard to establish for their children's future, was no longer what it seemed. It was empty, drained. The total amount was staggering. Over $200,000 had vanished, piece by piece, with no explanation. His mind raced, going over every conversation, every decision they had made. How had he missed this? Was this deliberate? Or was there some other, far more insidious reason behind Sarah's actions? The questions burned in his mind, each one more painful than the last. Paul sat back in his chair, taking in what he had just discovered. This wasn't just about money. This was about trust, about a betrayal that went beyond anything he could have imagined. For years, his wife had been hiding this secret, and now the truth was staring him in the face. He couldn't confront her yet, not without more answers. So, he decided to keep watching. The truth had a way of revealing itself, and he was determined to piece it all together, no matter the cost. The full extent of her deception was still out of reach, but Paul knew one thing for certain. He had to keep digging. What he had uncovered so far was only the beginning. The more Paul investigated, the more unsettling the discoveries became. The strange transactions weren't just limited to the mysterious withdrawals from the Children's College Fund. As he dug deeper into the records, he found additional, larger sums of money transferred to a handful of unknown accounts. These accounts weren't like the others. There were no utility payments, no family expenses. Instead, they had patterns of transfers and deposits that hinted at something far more personal. That's when he found it. A real estate transaction. A property had been bought in Sarah's name, an expensive, secluded house that Paul had never heard of. The funds came directly from their joint account, mixed with the siphoned money from their kids' savings. But it wasn't the property alone that threw Paul into turmoil. It was the name attached to the transaction. A man's name, someone who wasn't him. His heart sank. There, in black and white, was proof that Sarah had been using the money not for their family, but for something else. Someone else. Paul's suspicions deepened. It wasn't just the money anymore. It was everything. Her late nights, the sudden trips that seemed to come out of nowhere, the distant looks in her eyes when they'd talk about their future. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't confront her yet. Not until he had the full picture. Over the following weeks, Paul observed her more carefully. He watched for any signs, any slip-ups that might reveal more. It wasn't long before he found messages on Sarah's phone, messages that were clearly from the man involved with the property. Flirty, intimate exchanges filled with promises and longing. Each message was another nail in the coffin of the life he thought they had built together. His hands shook as he deleted the messages before Sarah could find them. He had to stay calm, continue to gather evidence without raising suspicion. He wasn't just dealing with a financial betrayal anymore. His wife was seeing someone else, and the world he had known was unraveling before his eyes. The time had come. Paul couldn't keep living in the shadows, piecing together a life of lies and secrets. He had gathered enough evidence to confront Sarah, but he knew it had to be done carefully. This wasn't just about finances anymore. It was about trust, loyalty, and the future of their family. One evening, after dinner, Paul sat across from her at the kitchen table. He had all the evidence laid out. Bank statements, real estate transactions, and text messages. Sarah seemed distracted, but when Paul's gaze fixed on hers, her smile faltered. He knew she was already aware something was off, but nothing could have prepared her for the full scope of what he had uncovered. "Sarah," Paul began, his voice steady, "I've been looking into our finances. Something doesn't add up." He slid a set of documents in front of her, watching her face as she glanced at the bank statements. "Why is there a property in your name? And why are our children's college funds being drained?" Sarah froze, her eyes flickering toward the door, as if considering whether she could escape or deny it all. "You don't understand," she whispered, trying to pull away from the confrontation. "I understand more than you think," Paul replied, calm but firm. "And I know about him too." Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" Paul didn't flinch. "You've been hiding things, Sarah. Things that affect all of us." He paused, watching her crumble inwardly. "I'm not leaving this table until we talk about everything." But even then, as she stumbled through her denials, Paul knew she was breaking. The cracks in her calm exterior were becoming visible. He didn't reveal everything he knew yet. He'd wait. But his mind was already racing, strategizing for the next step. Paul knew that confronting Sarah was just the beginning. The damage had been done, and now it was time to take control. His first move was clear. He needed to recover what had been taken from him, from their family. But that wasn't going to be easy. The stolen money wasn't just a financial betrayal. It was a deliberate, calculated crime. He needed more than just a conversation. He needed evidence, proof, and a way to get back everything that had been taken. He started with legal advice. He reached out to a lawyer who specialized in family law and financial fraud. The attorney walked him through the process of what needed to be done to recover the stolen funds and what options he had if Sarah refused to return the money willingly. He also learned about the possibility of filing for divorce on the grounds of financial deception and infidelity. The idea of divorce was painful, but it became clear that it might be the only way forward. Next, Paul started tracking every penny. He set up new bank accounts, moving what little money he had left into them to protect himself. He began carefully monitoring all transactions, scrutinizing everything that went in and out. It was exhausting work, but necessary. Every week he gathered more information, slowly building the case that would one day make Sarah face the consequences of her actions. Paul also reached out to a financial advisor who could help him rebuild the family finances. The advisor assisted him in creating a plan to recover the funds and ensure that their children's college fund was replenished. It would take time, but with the right legal and financial moves, Paul could recover some of what had been stolen. But the biggest move he made was planning the anniversary trip. It seemed like a simple romantic getaway, until Paul realized he could use it as the perfect opportunity to confront Sarah one final time. The trip would be the turning point. He would have the evidence in hand, and with the knowledge he had gathered, he would finally get the answers he needed. Paul had prepared himself for the possibility that Sarah might deny everything, but he was ready for it. This was the end game. Everything would change once they returned from that trip, and Paul knew exactly how to play his cards. The anniversary trip had been carefully planned, a picturesque getaway to a secluded hotel by the lake, far from the distractions of everyday life. But for Paul, the serenity of the location wasn't about rekindling romance. It was the perfect stage for the ultimate confrontation. As they checked in, Sarah was her usual self, blissfully unaware that this trip would be anything but peaceful. Once they were settled in their room, Paul remained calm, sitting at the edge of the bed while Sarah unpacked. He could feel the tension building as he mentally prepared himself for the confrontation he'd spent weeks planning. Finally, he spoke. "We need to talk, Sarah. It's time for you to hear everything." At first, Sarah shrugged, thinking it was just another one of their usual conversations about finances or family matters. But Paul's steady voice caught her attention. "I know about the property. I know about him. And I know about the money you've stolen from our children's future." Her face drained of color as she turned to face him, a sharp realization hitting her. She'd thought he was bluffing. She thought she had everything under control. But now, her world began to crumble. Paul revealed everything: the financial deceit, the affair, the hidden accounts. And as he spoke, Sarah's panic intensified. She started pacing, trying to piece together an excuse, a defense, but Paul remained composed. He watched as the panic in her eyes grew, seeing the walls of her carefully constructed lies collapse one by one. "I gave you everything," Paul said softly, his voice steady, though it was clear he was hurt. "And this is how you repay me. How you betray us all." Sarah's hands trembled and she opened her mouth to protest, but Paul cut her off. "There's nothing you can say now. It's over." As the weight of her actions hit her, Sarah sank to the bed, her body trembling with a mixture of disbelief and dread. She had lost everything. And Paul, unwavering, stood tall in front of her, ready to make the next move. The reality of the situation finally sank in for Sarah, and she broke down in front of Paul. Tears streamed down her face as the magnitude of her betrayal became undeniable. She wasn't just losing her marriage, she was losing her family, her financial security, and the trust of the people who had once adored her. The affair she thought was hidden, the money she had secretly funneled away, it was all coming to light, and there was no way to deny it anymore. Her voice cracked as she begged, "Please, Paul, we can fix this. I made a mistake, a huge mistake. Please don't take everything away from me." Paul, however, was resolute. He had seen the consequences of her actions too clearly to be swayed by her desperate pleas. "You've already taken everything, Sarah," he said. "The money, our trust, the future of our children. You've stolen from them, from me, and the damage has already been done." Sarah sobbed, clutching at him, trying to reach him, but Paul stood firm. "You have options. You can go to counseling. You can try to make amends. But none of it changes the fact that you've broken our family beyond repair." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The affair is over. The money will be returned, and you will face the consequences of your actions." She couldn't talk her way out of it. Paul's calm demeanor had driven home the truth. There was no escaping the destruction she had caused. The confrontation had done its job. There was no going back now. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift. Paul didn't waste time. He had already put his plan into motion, and now it was time to recover what had been stolen. He consulted with his lawyer to ensure the legal steps were taken to secure the return of the money. With the evidence he had gathered, they filed for a financial recovery claim, targeting the property Sarah had bought with the stolen funds. The process wasn't quick, but Paul made sure that every cent would be returned, including interest. His lawyer contacted the authorities, ensuring that Sarah's lover, who had been involved in the property transactions, would face legal repercussions as well. Paul didn't just want the money back. He wanted to make sure the affair ended, and that Sarah's actions would have consequences. It wasn't just the money from the college fund that he focused on. He also made sure to recover any other assets that had been illegally diverted for Sarah's personal use. The process of reclaiming the funds was meticulous, but Paul kept his eye on the goal: to secure his children's future. As soon as the funds were recovered, Paul transferred the full amount into their children's college savings accounts. He had taken the necessary steps to ensure that their future was no longer in jeopardy. The damage had been severe, but Paul knew he was doing everything he could to put things back on track. Once the stolen money had been recovered, Paul moved forward with the next phase of his plan, securing his children's future and protecting himself from any further financial damage. He filed for divorce, citing financial deception and infidelity as grounds. The legal process was grueling, but Paul was clear-eyed about his objectives. He needed to sever ties with Sarah for good and ensure that she would be held accountable for her actions. Through his lawyer, Paul ensured that Sarah would be financially responsible for the stolen funds, both in terms of the money that had been taken from the children's savings and the legal costs associated with the recovery process. Paul knew this would be a painful process, but it was necessary. He couldn't allow Sarah's betrayal to destroy everything he had worked for. The divorce proceedings were set in motion, and the financial settlement would include provisions to guarantee that Sarah paid restitution for the money she had stolen. This would not only punish her for her actions, but it would also provide Paul with the financial freedom he needed to move forward without her in his life. He also set up a plan to ensure that Sarah couldn't gain access to any of the recovered funds in the future. He had taken the necessary precautions, securing his children's futures and ensuring their education would not be affected. For Paul, the legal and financial resolution was the first step toward healing. The aftermath of the divorce left Paul with mixed emotions. The pain of betrayal lingered, but he knew he had made the right decisions. Rebuilding his life would take time, but he was committed to his children's well-being and future. They had been through enough, and Paul knew that the road ahead would be difficult for them as well. But he refused to let Sarah's actions define their lives. The first few months after the divorce were challenging. Paul had to navigate the complexities of single parenthood while also managing the emotional fallout. His children, though resilient, were affected by the changes. But through it all, Paul made a conscious effort to be present for them. He spent more time with them, engaging in activities they enjoyed and providing the emotional support they needed. Slowly, the bond between them grew stronger, and they began adjusting to their new reality. Paul also took time for himself, focusing on regaining his emotional stability. Therapy helped him process the pain of the betrayal, and he learned to forgive himself for not seeing the signs earlier. He didn't need to dwell on the past. He needed to move forward. As the months passed, Paul began to find peace. The financial recovery was well underway, and the legal battles were behind him. The sense of justice he had fought for was finally within reach. He no longer felt the weight of the betrayal holding him down. For the first time in a long time, Paul looked to the future with a sense of hope and purpose. He had secured the future of his children, and that was all that mattered. Looking back, Paul couldn't help but reflect on the years of betrayal, the deceit that had unfolded right under his nose. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had trusted Sarah completely, but in the end, her actions had shown him that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. Yet, through the pain and the turmoil, he had come to realize something far more important. The future of his children was something worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As he stood in front of their house watching his children play, Paul found a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. He had done everything he could to protect them from the fallout of their mother's choices. And while the scars of the past would always linger, he knew that the road to recovery was just beginning. The journey had been painful, but it had also been a lesson in resilience, justice, and the power of moving forward. Paul had secured a future for his children that was no longer dependent on lies and manipulation. He had found strength in the aftermath of betrayal and was ready to embrace a new chapter in life, one where the only thing that mattered was his family and their future. In the quiet moments of reflection, Paul realized that the pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer held power over him. He had won the battle, not just for his children, but for himself as well, and with that, he found closure, ready to face whatever came next with a renewed sense of purpose.